you mentioned peaceful braiding, which Virginia also highlighted again. And I think that's something that really seems to characterize your work, and also the feminine, like the braid and the weave and the tapestry. And so often when it comes to how we engage with history or mythology, it's done in such a like a materialist way that doesn't take into account like the embodied realities of what the past and ancestrality and history actually is. And there's something so powerful about this embodied approach that you're taking to your research. And then the use of these words like quest or unearthing or excavating. And it's this kind of embodied archaeology of like, what is this past? What does it mean to us? What does it mean to who I am and to the worlds that I want to create now? And there's such a massive disconnect from that reality, the reality of these things in our usual methods of inquiry, in our usual modes of learning and of research based on often a hierarchy of thought based on a particular worldview, which is the dominant one, which is creating a lot of these issues that we have. And as well to see it as a method of healing. And like, how is our study of the past the method of healing for the present as well in the cultural way? And which I love. So maybe it would be a good opportunity now for you to sketch out a little bit this alternate origin story of a Neolithic or pre-Neolithic European history. Like you use the word in your writing like traces. So like, what are the traces that we can see, and which are the ones that we're needing to reimagine as well? Because I know that in often cases, particularly when it comes to practice, like practices have been lost, they weren't written down and weren't protected. So often there's this relationship of like trace with also the reimagining and how they interrelate. And so, yeah, I would love you to share about that.
Yeah, that was all very beautifully said. So I guess what I would say is, the place where I first really encountered this sense of an alternate origin story was when I found the work of Marija Gimbutas, the Lithuanian archaeologist, who was beginning to publish mainly in the 1950s. And so she started out, what's interesting about her story is that she started out studying the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age, Kurgan, as it sometimes is called, and as she called it at the time, culture, which was definitely a patriarchal warrior culture. And she was very well respected in her field for this work that she did. She was seen as a leading scholar. She she fled Lithuania during World War II with her doctoral PhD manuscript under her arm, came to the US, was an early professor, or early, like hired at Harvard, early professor at UCLA, very respected. And she'd been studying these different burial mounds, particularly across Eastern Europe from the Bronze Age for a long time. But what she noticed, both from reading extensively across different site reports, so different archaeological site reports that detail everything found at a site, and also having been to different archaeological digs in those areas, what she started to piece together was that there was like a substratum beneath the Bronze Age Kurgan culture of a completely different pattern. And this was a Neolithic pattern that, like, the earth was like filled with small female figurines and beautiful, elaborate pottery with iconography on it that was very, very different than what came later. Burial patterns that were also very different, that suggested not, so in the later Bronze Age cultures, you would see the kurgans were these burial mounds that privileged a leading man who seemed to be in the, regalia of a warrior or a king. So there was like a celebration of war and violence and kingship and hierarchy. And he had a lot of nice stuff with him. Other people didn't. Maybe sometimes he's buried with wives or slaves or horses, etc. And this earlier Neolithic pattern, and what I love about this is that, like, this is a pattern in the earth that you can see from burial remains. In these earlier Neolithic cultures, and she was particularly studying them in Eastern and Southern Europe. That was kind of her like area of best expertise. It was really hard to tell what kind of hierarchies were going on, if any. It seemed to be that like older women had slightly more status objects in their graves. So grandmother aged potentially for that time period, like women in their 50s. But still the regalia that they had wasn't like extremely luscious compared to everyone else. So based on all of this evidence, this idea sprang for her from the evidence as opposed to her applying a kind of utopian ideal upon what she was seeing, which is, I think, something she's later been accused of. But she, like a tracker, like an animal tracker, actually, she just studied and studied and studied the traces until she was like, wow, I think there's a pattern. This is a pattern not just in the present day Ukraine, not just these are different places, not just in Bulgaria, but like, wow, we're really seeing it through Greece, in Anatolia, up through the Balkans, and then in different ways heading further up into Europe in this time period. And so she then turned her work toward these histories because it was so rich and really hadn't been studied much. And the minute she did that, and it's really interesting to observe this kind of in the story of her publishing as well. The first time she published about this was in a book called The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe. I forget the date of this. And I think shortly after, she changed the title of the book to The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe. And even just that change, I mean, this is so kind of shocking. It's like so obvious and kind of embarrassing that this is all it would take. But that one switch made kind of the academic world, male dominated, especially at that time, totally like start to ridicule her and just belittle things about what she was saying and undercut, even though before this, her work had been very respected. And so at the same time this was happening, that she was finding this work, this kind of alternate, deeper origin story going on. The second wave of feminism was also kind of stirring. And so many women turned to Marija as like almost a mother goddess of this older cosmology, which didn't do great things for her academic reputation, though it did beautiful things for many, many women and artists and all sorts. So, what I find fascinating is that the evidence is really so deep in the ground for something anyway that's not patriarchal. Like there's different ways to interpret exactly specifically what she was finding, but the overall pattern is so different and so oriented toward regeneration, regenerative forces in the earth, interdependence between all genders of people and all beings. And then this is also something that we can trace back to the Paleolithic in different ways, but I won't go into that right now. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Sylvia. You mentioned about the second wave feminism and the artists that conspired, and I was wanting to do a little call out to Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, which maybe some people have seen, which is such a beautiful rendering of this revival of like recognition of the ancient female lines, and it's in New York. And there's also an exhibition of hers currently in London. It's a beautiful celebration of this alternate history. And something that's so interesting when it comes to history and like recognized history, what goes into the history, but what is validated and seen as fact and truth within our current context, and why she was seen as threatening or didn't fit that paradigm. I find the interesting thing is where else we find history, where else we find these ancestral traces. And one is obviously story and myth and fairy tale. Fairy tale is probably in the European context like one of the most direct ways, because it was that oral storytelling of mothers to children, rooted in archetypal relations and constructions of identity and times and moments, transitionary moments in life, often. And so I wonder, like, I know this has been a piece of your research as well, and I would love to explore a little bit around this field and how we can read through the lines of dominant interpretations to see how fairy tales encode these indigenous mother lines of memory.
Yes. Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit earlier today, and just, the way that what you said about, just before I answer that directly, what you said about fairy tales, being passed from mother to child or grandmother to children. I don't remember where I read this. It might have been P.L. Travers, who was a wonderful mythologist. She wrote Mary Poppins, actually, saying that it's like fairy tales got almost the the deep myths of Europe got protected within fairy tales and within the nursery, so to speak, because, oh, they're just children's stories. So nobody ever could quite erase them, because they were just at a certain point this happened. I also think it's impossible to erase them because they're so native to us, all humans as storytelling creatures. But in terms of European fairy tales, there's a couple that come to mind that really root right back. And even I think in some ways were the first guides for me in thinking this way. And the one that first comes to mind is called The White Bear King Valamon. White Bear King, okay, but it's a Norwegian fairy tale. Another version of it is East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which maybe many people will be more familiar with that story name. And so in this story, just very briefly, there's basically a princess the third daughter, who marries a bear. I'll be very brief about it. I don't want to take too much time describing the whole story, but she has this longing and this dream that none of the other daughters of the king have, for this golden wreath that she dreams of. And all the jewelers in the kingdom can't recreate this wreath that she longs for. And so one day she's out in the forest wandering around, and there's this bear holding the wreath. And, he says, the only way you can have this wreath is if you marry me. So she agrees. She goes off into the woods with him, into his palace. At night, he becomes a man. And this is kind of the sanitized later European pattern in this story. Anyway, eventually she disobeys something that he's told her not to do, which is to look at him when he's sleeping, because she can never see who he is at night when he's a man. By day, he's a bear. She looks, he's taken from her. He has to go off to the troll queen who's cursed him, et cetera, et cetera. She goes on this long journey to be reunited with him. So this story has absolutely deep roots in very, very ancient Woman Who Married a Bear story patterns. And there's a really great book actually that just came out, and all the different threads back through Sami stories in far northern Europe, Finnish traditions, down through Central Europe, down into Greece. There's many different ancient bear mother mythologies, memories, mother bear figurines from very early old Europe, like 6000 BC in Bulgaria, all over the place. And this Woman Who Married a Bear story, it actually, it spans the earth in certain ways, but it is also deeply rooted in Paleolithic European ground. And it survives all the way within that Norwegian fairy tale, whenever that was collected in the late 1800s. And so that's one that springs to mind. Another that comes to mind is a little bit stranger, darker fairy tale, The Juniper Tree, by which the brothers Grimm collected. I don't know if you know this fairy tale, but it's kind of a favorite of mine, even though it's full of strange cannibalism and a stepmother killing her stepson. But there's something about it that I haven't all the way unpacked it yet, actually, but it's it draws me in over and over again, with this woman longing for a child who keeps going out under this juniper tree in her garden, and almost in this longing that she keeps speaking to the juniper tree, she finally kind of miraculously conceives a child. And then she's eating the juniper berries. It's very strange in that fairy tale way. She's eating the juniper berries and dies in childbirth, but gives birth to this son who is later, so she's buried beneath the juniper tree. Her bones are beneath it. So that image alone, I'm all right, juniper tree, mother's bones beneath the juniper tree. Juniper tree has such old magic across Europe and deep into the Paleolithic, actually. There's evidence that the torches that were carried down into the caves, the beautiful painted caves, of the Paleolithic, had fuses made of juniper wood. There's something about the way it burned, or juniper something, a juniper fuse. And so there's something about this deeply medicinal, magical, shamanic juniper plant tree, the mother's bones beneath it. And then later, when all this really hard stuff happens in the fairy tale, the little girl who's actually not that mother's daughter, but the stepmother's daughter, she goes repeatedly to that tree asking for help from kind of the original mother. And the bones the juniper and this bird who is her brother who's been killed transformed all kind of conspire to bring healing and rebirth and like a happy ending. So anyway, this story just like it's haunting. It's like haunted with the memory of something else, of a mother's bones under a tree, of ancestral worship almost of a mother. But it's so piecemeal there that it's kind of like an archaeological site itself, but you can feel it moving. The bird, the tree, the bones. Anyway, that one's like kind of in process for me when I think about it. So those are two that I would share.
Thank you, Sylvia. I adore listening to you tell those fairy tales and how sensorial fairy tales are. Like, I'd forgotten that about ingestion and tastes and smells and the physical experience of something in a process of change and transformation. And I was also reflecting a little bit when you were speaking. It was something around relationship with land. It was about how many histories can coexist alongside each other like this braid. And I think one of the great shames is the sense also of this pre-patriarchal, patriarchal, and we're forgetting the existence of that thread and that braid that is existing now, very in a little way to today. And in ancient history, but also less ancient history, there has been a recognition and a celebration of this matrilineal way of being. And I feel like one of the great shames is this erasure of this history and of this reality that has coexisted and coexists. And it's and the excavation, how it starts and it traces back. But in the process of finding and giving again a name to this pre-patriarchal old European memory, how we can then celebrate its continued reality and its continued existence through time from that point, and about reorienting ourselves around this idea of multiplicity on that front, and many truths coexisting. And I think it also helps us to recognize that it's a direct connection, and how we can then celebrate that. And then when it comes back to land and place, I wanted you to touch on your personal, which you mentioned at the beginning, your personal relationship with land and ecology and ecological study, as well as nature connection, animal tracking, and bird language, which you mentioned, and how these broaden out your experience of land and place and time, memory, history, and what role they have in this interrelationship in a time when they're often kept so separate and so distinct from each other.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and also just I just really appreciate that reminder of the beautiful coexistence of all of these stories at once, like this great soup of them. And I just wanted to speak to the fact that, for example, in textile traditions, often you see motifs that have just remained almost exactly the same, from like a Minoan, like Cretan vessel down to Cretan women's weaving in the 1970s. That's like 4,000 years of an image remaining, having, a value still. Like the tree of life is one of them, with a tree and a bird in it, actually, as it happens. So in terms of the animal tracking and nature connection, in certain ways, I would say it's like kind of my center point in my life, and also in terms of how I understand everything that I do and write, because I feel like without it, I'm just kind of a disembodied floating brain. And there's so many different things I could say about this. I'm trying to figure out like what is the most important thing to share. There's actually one story that's coming to mind in terms of kind of this journey for me in my life. And so when I was 16 and 17, but the first time when I was 16, my high school, this was like very progressive, offered wilderness rites of passage, or they called them vision quests at the time, which was somewhat appropriative. But so a wilderness fast where we went out for 3 days and 3 nights in Death Valley in the desert and fasted, which is, an initiation practice that happens across Indigenous North America, but also there's a history of it in Europe as well. And one of the guides had this water bottle that had this beautiful cordage woven all around it. And I was asking him on the long drive down to Death Valley, like, wow, what is that? Like, beautiful cord. And he said it was spun from nettle, stinging nettle. And I am at that point, this was like one of my first introductions into like deep land time, was in high school at age 15 and 16. But I had grown up on fairy tales and grown up with this love of fantasy novels as well. Fantasy, but specifically like that felt historical and that felt historically rooted actually in Europe, because I think I was hungry for that ancestral story and hungry for the magic that I felt in fairy tales and in fantasy like that, where women could speak to animals, where women shapeshifted into animals, where, the sister, this is from the Six Swans fairy tale, and this is where the nettle comes in. A sister can weave her brothers shirts of nettle and turn them back from swans into men. And it was around this age, due to this like deep land time that I was like so lucky to get at that age, that I started to see that the magic that I was longing for from those seemingly fantasy novels and fairy tales that I thought like a woman can't really talk to an animal, right? Like she can't. I started to realize that actually deep earth literacy is the magic. Like it is the magic. And so anyways, I'm in the van with this guide and he tells me it's stinging nettle. And I'm like, what? This was like one of the most mind-blowing moments of my life at that point. I had no concept that people spun things from stinging nettle, that like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, but this is the Six Swans fairy tale, don't you realize? And he didn't know what I was talking about. But it was like this moment where these two worlds came together for me. And I saw how deeply, deeply listening and learning, like not just listening, but actually like studying the patterns of animal feet and what marks they make on the land and all the different subtle differences in bird sounds and bird language are the kind of the magic key that open the story of the actual ecology around you to you. And it's a long study. Like I studied for many years in my 20s and I'm by no means an amazing expert, but went through like certification and just was like really devoted to it for a while, because it felt to me that if I did not, wherever I was as a writer, so in California, I did this the most. But I did my best when I was living in Crete, and I'm learning here. If I'm not rooted to those stories of the more than human, as David Abrams has called it, the more than human world, the living world all around me, I'm not telling full, embodied, rooted stories. Like, I don't want to hear more humans talking about humans. Like this kind of narrative monologue that we have with just our own species, treating everything else as an object and not a subject in its own right, belonging within the great play of our novels, of our short stories, of everything. This is what got us here. And so I just felt very strongly from about age 18, maybe, like when all of this was unfolding in me, that like if I don't know what's going on ecologically around me, I'm not telling the whole story. And of course I can never tell the whole story, right? But like I have a duty to listen humbly as best I can and do my best with it, right? So, and the other thing I just want to say about the tracking is that I have never felt more mentally well. Like we're just like mentally healthy as when I was in my deepest animal tracking training. It just made everything else go quiet. As I'm saying this, I'm like, I need to like go back into that kind of big training again, because to be so focused on minutia on a sand dune, trying to tell like, okay, is this a coyote? Yes, this is a coyote track. Were they leaning a little bit more into this toe because they heard something and were looking that way for a moment? Or like, how can I tell how long ago this track was here, etc.? Like that level of focus that uses like a lot of brain power, but also kind of the full body as an instrument of receptivity and integration and knowledge. Like it felt like it made